Hello everyone. As you guys are all having a council meeting on the 19th there, I will not be able to do it as I will be asleep during that period of time. However, I wanted to give you a brief overview of how the economic system is progressing and that work is still being done on it. Emperor John has been doing a lot of work on the user interface, primarily the map system, because that will be actually allow us to do the bulk of our work, such as building buildings, moving units, and all that will be done through an actual map interface. And so he's working really hard on that. And hopefully he's at the meeting to give you a brief overview of what he is doing in regards to that. However, I want to give you an overview of what I am doing in the economic system and how basically what I'm working on is the overall money flow, resource flow, and how all that's going to tie in. So I want to give you a brief overview of how that works. So first off, within the New Economic Systems Forum, there's a basic resource tech tree, as it were. This basic tech tree basically shows how resources flow within our economic system to produce more highly advanced resources and so forth. So you can look at that and it'll give you a brief overview of what each building does and what each resource feeds into. However, if you want to look at the actual numbers of like how much it takes to build said buildings or how many of a certain resource it takes to build another, this is what I've been working on and balancing for the past couple of weeks now. So say you have a building, in this case I have Siphon revealed here. You want to build the building, and you're going to build this building in the user interface that Emperor John's working on, and you'll be building these buildings in each individual hex, and a hex will be able to have a certain number of buildings in it, not yet fully determined, but I'm thinking somewhere around 6, or up to 6 buildings in a hex. And basically, if you want to build a building, it's going to have a construction cost, and you're going to have building materials, which another building actually produces that resource. Building materials and curbits to build that building in the first place. And some of the more advanced buildings have an other, or some like electronics, high-tech components. They'll have a certain additional cost to it aside from the building materials and curbits. Now say that you want to use the siphon to produce, as the siphon does, fresh water. So it can produce stuff at a certain rate. So it produces, its output is fresh water, and it can produce a maximum of 10,000 units of fresh water. However, to do that, you must first activate the building. When you activate the building, you have to pay an activation cost. In the case of the siphon, it's 3 Kerbal watts, as I'm calling it at the moment, and 20,000 Kerbits. And eventually we're going to put in Kerbals as well for an employment portion here. But I have yet to determine those numbers. But you're going to activate this building, so regardless of the number of output units, regardless of the number that you're going to do here, the maximum is 10,000, but you could only do, 5,000 if you wanted to. But regardless of what you're going to push out, you're always going to have to pay this activation cost. It's like a baseline cost. And then in addition, for every unit that you want to make, in the case of a siphon, it's producing from it's a raw resource, or it's pulling from a raw resource, or a hex tile in and of itself. So it says raw here. But at the cost of 1 Kerbit, it will produce 1 unit of fresh water, up to 10,000 units in this one building. And so not only will you have the activation cost, you'll have this 1 Kerbit per unit cost as well, or in the case of this, up to 10,000 Kerbits in addition. And so this allows for a nice scaling thing in how these buildings work. Now this logic extends to these other raw input ones, or buildings that extract directly out of a hex. They have their own building costs, their own activation costs, and their own production cost, or how costly it is to pull out that resource from the hex up to its certain maximum amount. So in the case of, say, crude oil, it takes 40 Kerbits to produce 1 crude oil unit, and this one building, the oil drill, can produce up to 1,000 units of crude oil in a turn. And so that's how all these work. Now the mine, which is also a raw output, simply has multiple things that it can actually produce. It can produce coal, which will feed into power plants that will allow your buildings to actually be activated. Titanium ore, aluminum ore, copper, gold, RKM, rare Kerbal metal ore, and uranium ore. All these things will be able to be pulled out of a hex, as they are raw, at a given price per unit up to a certain amount. And all the numbers that you see in here are relatively balanced at the moment, but we won't really know how they work until we do some play testing, which hopefully won't be too much longer depending on how the user interface is going. Now, ultimately, these raw resources, or these things that we get from our raw materials, need to feed into something else. So, for example, the electrolysis lab uses fresh water, which our siphon produces. It takes 1 unit of fresh water at a cost of 50 cubits to produce 2 units of H2 gas, up to 10,000, and, in addition, 1 unit of O2, up to 5,000. So eventually you're going to recombine these to create rocket fuel, or siphon off O2 for life support, and H2, I'm guessing we'll use that for RCS, since that sounds something like the Kerbals would do. So that will be overall our, that'll be how this level 1 freshwater thing gets turned into a higher order resource. Now this extends through all the rest of the buildings that we have, which I have outlined here. Eventually that H2O2, as I said, will recombine to produce rocket fuel at a certain cost and a ratio of those two together to a certain amount for that building, and so on and so forth. The mill uses logs from the logging town, which you saw earlier, and produces the building materials that you're going to use to build all of your buildings, and so on and so forth. All these buildings are in that tech tree that I kind of showed to you. And so that's basically how everything's going to work. We're getting these numbers. It's fairly well balanced at this point in time with comparison to how I envision corporations or nations building units, which I have been working on, though it has been aggravating since solid rocket boosters are in no way whatsoever consistent between between modders, but I'm trying my best to get all that to work. So that's basically how this is going so far. It's fairly well balanced. We're working in, Emperor John and I are working in a lot of these different components, such as Kerbals and power and all the equations and everything that binds them all together. So hopefully this was a good, good insight into how we are progressing into the economic system. So I hope you guys have a productive meeting tomorrow, and I'll catch y'all later.